Yes, so I'm here because I'm supposed to know about professional ethics, all the professions. I'm not an expert on climate change, though I sort of feel I am now after today. I started with a group of other people, university-wide ethics center at Harvard more than 30 years ago. And the aim was to try to strengthen the teaching and research on ethics and broaden ethics teaching in all the professions beyond the narrow kind of ethics that you heard described by our legal academic from Harvard. Professional ethics was not very prominent in the profession at that time, at least not the kind of ethics that required serious intellectual reflection or broader social responsibility. That began to change gradually, not entirely because of our efforts at Harvard, but I admit, but mostly, as with many things in ethics, it was driven by scandals. That usually gets people's attention, and they care about ethics again. I mean, that's why, scandals, ethical scandals, are good for ethics professionals. Our own center, by the way, was located in a building named for Alfred A. Kaufman. If you remember, he went to jail for price fixing in the auction market. And there we were, sitting in this beautiful building, and it was quite luxurious, honoring a price fixer. So partly as a result of these scandals, ethics courses began to be required in many law schools, many medical schools. Some of them were broader than the narrow courses that had been taught in the past. Professional associations took notice. Applied ethics journals popped up everywhere. Degree programs, you could specialize in it. The ethics movement spread. It gained momentum not only among the traditional professions, but also in the training of police officers. We had a graduate or ethics program who went and trained the New York Police Department. How well that turned out. Veterinarians, accountants, even economists, Harold, who just finally, with their last academic discipline to adopt a serious code of ethics, despite your comments earlier, this last year, the economists, everybody else had some. My favorite example of how far it spread, I brought along because I thought you might not believe it. Those of us who teach, you'll recognize we get free textbooks in the mail all the time. People are trying to get us to adopt them. And ethics teachers are no different. So when this appeared in my mail, I first looked at undertaking ethics. I thought, you try to engage in. No, this is a gerund. They mean undertakers ethics. And I mean, just give you they have many case studies with multiple choice answers. In a small cemetery, the deceased is buried in the wrong grave because the stone was engraved on the wrong side of the marker. You are the only one who knows. You call the monument company and they should read. You tell the cemetery they made an error. You contact the client. You sit on it. It's not your problem. Proverbs says someone getting into an argument which is not theirs is like pulling the ears of a dog. So they have serious problems, but interestingly, what is beginning to happen, I'm told, I'm not an expert on undertaking ethics, They're actually talking about the damage to the environment by having cemeteries all over the place, and what are we going to do, because there are going to be more dead people than we have room for. So I think that's progress. But still, all this growing interest in professional ethics, in many ways welcome, was mostly limited to only one aspect of the ideal of professionalism, the ideal of service, which is, as several people said earlier, it has been inherent in the idea of professing the professions from the beginning, although it lost and it's had its ups and downs. But the current revival still emphasizes that the service is to the patient, the client, the shareholder, the research community. This is where I think the other professions are like, or in a very general way, the sciences, or the cadaver too. I don't want to leave out that. The revival has only recently begun to attend to the obligations that professionals may have to bring to bear their expertise on the public purpose, as Nancy said at the beginning. We professionals enjoy great privileges, and in return we owe something to society, not only to the individuals we directly serve, but to the larger society, to the public purposes for which the professions profess to believe in. So this conference actually exemplifies a return, or a revival really, of that aspect of the professional ideal. You've heard and contributed to bringing that back. In fact, I would say 97% of you agree that that's what we should be doing. Now,
is that peer reviewed?
The 3%, please raise your hand. The attempting to fulfill that obligation, which this has also been brought out here, is not easy. There are practical limitations of time, resources, funding, psychological limitations that we heard about, and political pressures. The public health panel today particularly, I thought, was good at bringing out those constraints and some possible ways to overcome them. But the service to the public, in some ways, is a difficulty because it may conflict with other internal, these other things were outside, internal moral obligations of professionals. And that may even be harder to change than, I don't know whether it's harder, but it's certainly harder for us as professionals to think about how we might be more active, we might serve the public, not just because we're used to doing it some other way or because of the political pressures, but because there is a real moral basis for some of the these particular kinds of constraints. And I thought this wonderful academic panel toward the end moved in the direction of activism. I was ready to cheer and sign up, but I think compare that to the first panel, where there was much more, it's particularly Rob, but also Naomi, much more appreciation of nuance and the dangers of compromising some of the academic or professional role responsibilities. And what I'm going to suggest is there is this internal tension in the professions, in each professional role, That makes it hard, but also means we have to think about redefining. And so you won't think I've been picking on the last panel. They were actually doing that. They were recognizing, no, this is going to require redefinition or a change in the traditional role. The only thing I would say is yes, but the traditional role had some values that we don't want to lose. So let me mention just three. Let me put these in terms of risks to values we ought to care about. And the suggestion is not that it's always going to happen, but that you should recognize as we advocate changing the role, that we don't want to lose what made us respectable, moral professionals to begin with. So bias, undue bias, let me put it that way. If you're going to be effective in public debate, professionals have to act more like advocates than judges. Now, lawyers, initially I thought, well, lawyers won't have any trouble with that because they do a lot of advocacy anyhow. And Katie, in the first part of her remarks, said that's a very natural thing. But then I thought, well, maybe I should just... Then she went on to say, well, the problem is if you're an advocate, you're likely to do some things that we might really question, like, what was your term? Agonistic?
Agnostic.
Agnostic, yes. And, sort of morally questionable things, even as an advocate. And Mr. Justice complicated my picture of judges because the traditional role would require particular, Sam mentioned the 5 characteristics of the law, but also the idea that judges should decide particular cases between particular people. And our judge said we should think universally. That really requires a change, at least in American jurisprudence, requires some change in the role. And some loss of the values of the traditional role. So, Harold said, competitive sport. It is. Being an advocate is engaging in a competitive sport, and you've got to be careful that in that competition you don't end up treating it just like a sport. There is a role for the honest broker or the traditional judge, and there was a reason for that. That has some value, and while we want to overcome it in some ways, we don't really want to ignore it. So bias problem. Second problem of the 3, simplification. If you're going to be an effective in the public sphere or in really outside of your field of expertise, a certain amount of simplification is necessary. And there are some people who are very successful at making that translation. But most of us are not, even if we think we are. Jessica probably is on good, but because she knows how to talk on TV. Some of my colleagues are rock stars. They have thousands of people in a stadium and they can talk. But most of us can't do that without distorting. I mean, it's really hard to simplify complex subjects, as you know, and reach a public. And it's harder, I mean, I think Jacob said it's a form of teaching, and I agree with that, except it's a lot harder. You can do it for students and in a back and forth situation, and they can add the complexities. In a public forum, it's much harder to do that without distortion. And finally, I would say that I go back, it's related, the final point, but it is distinct. Exaggerated consensus. I mean, our authority, this goes back right to the very illuminating, wasn't debate, but some tension between Naomi and Rob at the beginning. You do want, I mean, part of our authority as experts comes from the fact that other experts agree with us. If it's just chaotic, random, you know, everybody, all the experts have different opinions, there's no reason to listen to the experts. So not only the effectiveness, but the rationale for respecting experts and professionals is that on the whole there's some consensus. But as we heard earlier, also part of the reason for respecting professionals, and this particularly scientists, but is that they're open to being wrong, to recognizing that not everybody agrees, and one sign of that is there is disagreement. On climate change, there isn't much about that, you know, humans cause climate change and the effects are going to be really bad. But that consensus immediately breaks down as soon as you talk about what to do about it. And whether it's possible to keep those two things straight, even in the scientific community, I think it's hard. People say, we agree on this, but if you agree on that, you certainly shouldn't be in favor of nuclear power. Well, one famous climate change scientist was in favor of nuclear power. So the consensus is it's an issue, I think, that we haven't fully dealt with. So we've got three internal tensions within the professional role. And I think we've heard examples of this applying in each of the four areas. And it's not enough to say we should try harder, we should get more resources, or we should get more funding. We've got to help ourselves to rethink within our professions, and maybe we can learn from one another, from other professions, about how the role can be reconceived without losing what was valuable before, without losing what made us professionals in the traditional ideal and gave us the authority to speak. So we have time, and I would like to entertain not just questions of me, although I'm glad to answer them, but an effort to address what I see as a central question that's run through the discussion today. How can we preserve what was good about being a professional? And while moving to accommodate or deal with these new challenges that are in many ways unprecedented, climate change, main example today. Or do you think there's no tension at all? Do you think I've created there were some suggestions earlier that, you know, advocacy and analysis are not incompatible? Well, they're not in some sense, but so what I would like to hear is, have you struggled with this? Is this a this set of false conflicts I've set up here, even though I got them from you? Or you know, I'd like to see a little more struggle and a little less consensus. So thoughts are welcome. Yes?
I'd like to share a story.
Good.
So I think it's relevant to the discussion we're having. Things have changed since then, but in 2004, I was with the United Nations. I attended the first climate conference that was held in Montreal at that time. And it was really shocking because you had ministers that were in negotiations trying to decide what would be an acceptable amount of greenhouse gas concentration in the environment. You know, how many parts per million or how many degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels is acceptable. And they had no clue. Then you had these side events where scientists were giving presentations on this is what's going to happen at 1 degree, at 2 degrees, at 3 degrees, and you're looking at coral bleaching and many other things that are happening. And literally, as a UN official, I was literally going to each group and saying, why aren't you talking to each other? You know, why are you scientists absorbing more responsibility as scientists. And they say it's not our responsibility, that's for the policymakers. And the policymakers were, risk averse, like most government officials are. They're like, well, we better, let's tread carefully and let's see where the interests are and what instructions we're going to get from capital. So I'm using this example to raise a question really, which is, given this unprecedented crisis that we're now facing, where do we draw the lines in terms of how far we must extend our own professional responsibility beyond a comfort zone? And I think that was the point that you raised, Jessica, in your sort of feeling about, I need to transition more to being an advocate. And I think this is really what I'm hearing in this discussion today.
Yeah, but what do you say to the scientists that are sitting in their meeting and the policymakers are over here?
Talk to each other.
Yeah, you said talk to each other, and what the scientist says, look, I don't want to get my hands dirty with all that. It'll undermine the credibility of my work here for the UN. You called me here as a scientist, not as a politician. They're all politicians over there. What do you say?
So what helps that, and I think it's moved, this is 14 years ago, I think the situation has improved tremendously since those days.
Really?
It has. I think it has. I think there's much more, there's more conversation, there's more information. I think people are listening more to one another and listening to the kids who, in that horrible year, 2009 in Copenhagen, there were a bunch of kids walking around with t-shirts saying, how old will you be in 2050? I think that made people start to pay more attention.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
So I think things are kind of changing and moving, and there's a generational shift as well. But I do think part of it is structural, because even within the international community discussions within the UN has been, how do we mainstream, let's say, climate change within development? Or how do we mainstream, human rights, or this or that, the other? Everything should be switched. It's not how do we bring climate change into that. How do we bring all that into the climate change? Because all we have is this veneer, between us and death, really. So there needs to be a whole shift in thinking, and I think an expansion of personal responsibility and professional responsibility.
Well, it's good. I mean, until you mentioned the veneer of death, I was thinking this was a hopeful comment. But do we agree that things are getting better, that it's easier now for a scientist to somehow enter into debates, discussions with the policymakers without compromising his or her? Sorry, Charles.
I think the important thing is to keep the facts separate to the policy recommendations, which is the ICPP's standard. I think they present their report, based on this model, that model, the sea level rise will be in this range. But the policy of what to do next or how to tackle this is not included in that report. It's a separate thing. Should you have more solar, more this or more that? But the same individuals can play both roles, but I think it's important to keep the facts as the facts and the policy recommendations as the policy recommendations, and not mix the two together.
Good. Okay. I mean, is that possible? Those of you who, that would be a neat solution, because that would protect the objectivity of the scientist or the neutrality of the professional public health person. And, you change roles. You're a scientist or a professional public health person or a professor, but then you put on your public citizen hat, really stepping out of the profession, and you advocate for whatever particular policy. Does that work? Robert?
I wonder whether there's, yes, there's lots of tension in the areas you mentioned, but I wonder whether you're emphasizing the wrong tension. That is, for instance, in the scientific panel with Rob and Naomi this morning, I don't think they were talking about their sense of themselves as a true scientist being threatened by their advocacy. Rather, they were talking about the struggle to combine their knowledge as scientists with an advocacy that could make its mark. And the difficulties lay, the tension lay, in the attacks they received, while seeking all the time to be accurate and scientific without losing any of those attributes that gave them standing in the first place. And in a sense, the whole conference is about that theme. I don't know of any major climate scientist or scientist in general who has related to climate, who has himself or herself felt compromised because of having an advocacy and a public voice. Rather, they've been attacked, often falsely, because the powers that be or the opponents of confronting climate change refuse to allow for the possibility of a genuine professional taking a public stand. In a way, the absence of a public stand on the part of professionals has been so glaring and in the past and so one-sided in terms of a biased professional system that the struggle to emerge as an advocate while still a scientist has been made difficult. But that doesn't mean that those who do that cease being or have conflicts about their sense of being a genuine scientist in applying scientific knowledge to advocacy.
Yeah, I wasn't suggesting that they never necessarily felt it themselves, but that some of the criticism that they were getting or inviting presupposed that they were abandoning their pure professional role. And part of the challenge, if you take the suggestions here, is how to get the public to understand that the role isn't as neutral or analytical as, that there isn't a tension between the two. I mean, that's what you're challenging. But, you know, this is like talking about, we talk about political theorists who are not present. We say, what would Rawls think? Well, we have Rob and Naomi, and they, do you, what's this, is there anything to this tension?
Of course there is. The tensions are very real. Whole lab that we have in Princeton is, you know, one of the leading climate modeling units of the world, 2 miles over there, Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Lab, about 100 professionals, extremely protective of the reputation of the institution. It's part of the Department of Commerce, NOAA, which is one of the best acronyms in the American government, National Ocean Administration.
Could you speak up a bit?
Yeah, sorry. So we have GFDL, our climate lab next door, extremely protective of its reputation collectively, over and above what the individuals are concerned about. And the directors, all of them, I guess, have been determined not to lose the reputation of calling the shots as honestly as they can. So this tension is real. The IPCC was invented before your 2004 meeting. Pauline, I think you're talking about 1990 approximately.
1988.
88.
See, it's good to have a historian.
I consider 2 years pretty good. But the whole purpose of that was to get a communication between scientists and the government, national governments. There's another role of almost anybody who calls himself a scientist, which is as a teacher. And so when I imagine these 2 rooms you're talking about, and I would get out, I would walk into the other room, say, is there any questions you've got? I'd love to figure out something I could help you with. And I think most of my colleagues would see that as an opportunity. That's the other hat that anybody in all of our professional worlds, not all limited to science, feels. If I can possibly help you understand something, that's what I did all this work to get to this point.
Well, it's good that,
before.
so teaching may actually be the resolution.
I think it is a part of the resolution,
Yeah,
yes.
it's good. Naomi, since
Yeah,
you were,
I hesitate to say more because Robert always says what I'm thinking with so much greater eloquence and even more years of wisdom. But, so I agree with everything Robert said, and I'll just try to add a few things. I think the tensions you articulated are real, and I think on a personal level, I think about it all the time. As a historian, part of the job of any historian is to develop some kind of historical compassion or empathy for the historical actors to try to understand why the actions that they made at those times made sense to them. And Robert's work has been important for me in understanding the power of rationalization, justification. You know, there are the story you told about the Nazi doctors helping each other get used to the idea of what they're doing. But at the end of the day, you don't have to agree with it. You can understand why Bill Nuremberg became emergence of doubt and still think that at the end of the day he was wrong to have done that. And that involves the normative aspect of our work, which is, I think, what I take Jessica to be asking us to engage with more deeply. And so for me, one of the questions is the asymmetry that we're so incredibly worried and nervous about, quote, being biased, and yet we seem to have no concern at all about standing neutral in the face of a cosmic existential dilemma. And when we do nothing, we are doing something, which is to maintain the status quo. And I took that to be a big part of Jacob's comments as well. That, you know, the legal profession, and I, as the mother of a student at Harvard Law and a guest lecturer in the systemic justice class, I've witnessed that as well. Doing nothing is to reinforce the status quo. And in the face of a huge challenge, that to me is ethically unacceptable. And so I guess what I would like to just see us do is kind of, in a way, level the playing field to say, yes, the traditional values that you discussed, they are important, and there are reasons we have those values, and they've served us well in certain ways, but they've served us not so well in other ways. And to have a more engaged conversation about that balance, I think, is partly why I came here today. And I just want to say one other thing also about power relations. One of the things that I found so interesting in my work is that when I try to talk to scientists about different kinds of issues and problems that we face, and there's no question there are concerns about reputational issues, but I think those are totally tied up with everything that we heard other people talk about today about the external pressures from the fossil fuel industry, who are deliberately looking for every possible opportunity to discredit us, and therefore have made, you know, us, climate scientists, people in the climate community, you know, so nervous that anything we say that's even, you know, the smidgen incorrect is going to be taken out of context and used against us. It's made people gun-shy and nervous and intimidated, which of course is exactly the point. So the response to that is not to say, yes, you're right to be intimidated, but to say, well, there are things we can do to support you in the face of these challenges, which is one of the reasons I became involved in the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund. But when I try to talk about these power relations, oh man, that's when our academic colleagues get crazy nervous. Even my colleagues in history, which frankly, history is all about power, right? So why is that? Why is, of all the things we talk about in the world, we talk about psychology, I mean, everybody's totally happy to talk about the cognitive reasons why we resist climate change, totally happy to talk about the psychological issues, even happy to talk about, you know, the winners and losers if we have a carbon tax. All those issues are totally fine to talk about, but you try to talk about the asymmetry of power relations and carbon lock-in, suddenly it's like you're a communist or something. So I would just, I mean, I love the fact that you raised that issue, and I hope that we can have a much bigger conversation someday soon, about why it is that that's such a hard thing to talk about in our culture, and why as academics we have so much difficulty talking about the large structural relations that are keeping us in this place, which we all know beyond any reasonable doubt, I won't use the word incontroversial, but to borrow a good concept from our legal friends, we know beyond any reasonable doubt that this problem is real, it's happening, and it's really, really serious. And why are we so stuck and unable to talk about the power relations that are keeping us stuck in that place?
Well, you made two important points. We did hear, as you acknowledged, from Jessica and Nancy, political scientists, that's what we do. We talk about power relations, but interestingly, and that was pretty compelling, a lot of political scientists are not paying attention to the subject of environmental problems, let alone the power relations that are preventing that. So, yeah, we should, I mean, that's a plea to political science. Your first point I thought was particularly interesting because it's sort of your historical side coming out. The normative, the historians are not as normative as they should be, but you are. Normative principles can still be normative even if their weight varies depending on the circumstances or historical circumstances. So while at a certain time it may be very important to insist on objectivity, stay in the classroom, stay in the lab, serve your client if you're a lawyer, your patient if you're a doctor, but the weight changes. You have lots of different obligations. The weight changes when there's a catastrophe or a crisis, and some values inherent in your role become more important than others. And I take your point to being that we're in a circumstance where the balance, it's so out of balance in one direction that we need to shift back. I mean, is that a fair?
Yeah, it is. If I could just say, it is, and thank you, I appreciate that. I would just say one other thing, that I wouldn't agree with what you said about objectivity. And actually, I had a whole section in my presentation that was going to be about that, but I left it out for interest of time. But I do think that one of the important things that stands in the way of our doing some of the important things we need to do as witnessing professionals has to do with a mistaken notion of objectivity. So many of us have been raised to think of objectivity as a trait that inheres in us as an individual, and that if we take a position, we are therefore no longer objective. And I think that is a complete misreading of objectivity, and those of you who heard my Tanner lecture here last year know about that. But I think that one of the things that the last 50 years of research in history and philosophy and sociology of science has shown is that objectivity in science is a collective accomplishment, not an individual one. So as individuals, we can come to conclusions based on our work. We can do scientific work that meets the standards of our communities. The chips fall where they fall, and when they fall, we say, oh my God, I can't just stand here and do nothing now that I understand, as Bill puts it, the gravity of this situation. So that's an objective conclusion based on doing objective work. And so, if anyone's interested, my Tanner lectures will be published, another shameless plug, but my Tanner lectures will be published by Princeton University Press next year, and I discussed this at great length, and I hope people will read it. And
if you don't, she will kick you.
No, by then I will hopefully have lost this. Anyway, but the objectivity piece is really, really important, and again, it's a big one we could talk about for a long time, but I just wanted to say something about it.
Sam has been with.
To follow Harold's invocation of sports metaphors, it was humbling to watch Michael Jordan leave basketball and become a truly mediocre baseball player who never got out of the lowest rungs of the minor leagues. And it turns out that people in this room are defined by a level of professional accomplishment in certain disciplines which may not translate to other fields the same way that Michael Jordan discovered he could hit neither a fastball nor a curveball, despite his basketball prowess. And the difficulty is, I used to be, before I went to the academy, I was a litigator. And there was nothing, and I used to do a lot of cross-examination of expert witnesses. And there's nothing I dreamed of more than the article where the witness lowered the professional standards, and so I could take that person apart on cross-examination. And the reason was because the person showed a willingness to abandon precisely what gave him the authority, or her the authority, to speak in the courtroom. And my role as an advocate was to lay that bare for everyone to see, and it was usually not a pleasant experience for the witness. And the risk that you have going into the public domain is that it's a different metric, it's a different métier, it's something that you may not be good at. Politics and policy is about power. Academics fight over faculty meeting issues. They don't know real power and real struggles and real interests. And so collectively, when associations speak, that has authority. When scientists do the value added of giving us the information necessary for the policy debates, that's great. Some have the ability to cross over. I doubt whether very many will be effective. And the problem in today's environment political environment is that the people who you most want to reach are most skeptical right now of professional authority. If you are contaminated with watering down in any fashion the authenticity of your scientific stance in order to be more effective publicly, my concern is that it will have exactly the opposite effect, that it will diminish your professional stature and you will not be effective in the policy, in the political domain, because most of us just don't work well there.
And would you say then that could have an effect on others, even the more qualified, not the expert witnesses you destroyed, but the true experts? Yeah. They did, I would say anyhow, that it is a collective enterprise of the profession, and when you have some people being frauds or being exposed as talking beyond their expertise, that has a ripple effect on others.
I think it does.
Yeah.
And
Now, the only thing I'd say, what do you think about your obligations as a litigator trying to destroy these these experts? I mean, did you feel?
I had no problem with it. I thought they transgressed the role. I thought they had a legitimate role. I use expert witnesses, I rely on them in all sorts of circumstances. I never want, when I'm involved, I never want them to go beyond their expertise. I don't want them to show me passion on my side. I distrust that because let me have the passion. This is a collaborative enterprise, and it's what's your value? I see this as what's the value added of these professionals, and the value added is the scientific rigor that they can bring to the analysis of a problem. If you have personal passions, that's great, but I don't want a blending of the roles.
But Judge Benjamin, you earlier said you had your hand up, but I want to provoke you a little bit. Do you agree with Sam? Your view seems to be much more expansive and going beyond the expertise of the judge. If you're going to have universal effects, how can a judge possibly know all of those things? Aren't you at risk of the same sort of thing that Sam is saying, that any expert is at risk?
Well, I totally agree with him. The issue of, I was writing down here, terms that were used by different speakers of credibility, neutrality, objectivity. This is even more central for judges. So, to use a term that Sam has just referred, for a judge to show passion for a particular case or outcome, it shows that the procedure that was put in place was just a formality, was not really to convince. There was no purpose in convincing. I think it's a violation of due process. But I also believe that for judges, and I don't know if this applies to scientists, to use your words, the need of an honest broker. This is not so much about you, your feelings, how you perceive yourself, but it's external. It's how others, and especially society, perceive yourself. So if you have strong passions in respect to climate change, but you still think, well, I can be an objective judge, I can decide with impartiality a particular case, I think this is a territory that is not very safe for judges, because the judge has to consider what people think about him and about her. And one last comment is about can knowledge be perceived as being an indication of partiality. Because this is a dilemma that we judges face. If you specialize in a particular area, like environmental law, does make you less objective, less neutral, and less impartial. Quite often we, especially reporters, when they come, they want to interview you after a conference like this, say, you as an environmentalist. So the first thing, I'm not an environmentalist. I teach environmental law. I happen to know this legal discipline. What is interesting to realize is that this type of association between knowledge and neutrality or non-neutrality and bias and so on does not apply when a judge is an expert on private law. So if you are an expert on bankruptcy and you are protecting those that fail and at the expenses of sometimes the collective interest, or if you are an expert on banking law or insurance and you have very strong views in respect how the legal system should work in favor of that particular industry, this is not considered to be biased. And it seems to me because it's usually a knowledge that is associated with the strengthening of property rights, contracts, and so on, as opposed to when you are an expert in areas like the environment or similar fields of law in which the collective interest and going beyond the individual is at the center. And in this case, it becomes more complicated.
Interesting. Idea, bias because of your expertise in a particular area may make sense if it were actually distributed across all particular areas. But I guess you're suggesting that there's a asymmetry between what people think about as bias with judges who happen to know about environmental law and judges who happen to know about property law. Jessica.
So this has been a really interesting conversation, and I think the tensions that you identify are absolutely correct. And to go back to Harold's point about institutions, there's a fundamental tension between preserving the epistemic legitimacy of whatever professional community we're talking about and creating new norms. And the problem is, so the creation of new norms comes from individuals, right? Individuals within these institutions. And the problem is that you only know if they're successful ex post, right? And that's only if their authority, new normative claims or authority claims have been legitimated by others within that community, right? So there's this constant sort of dance that has to happen between the sort of entrepreneurs or the agents and the structure, which is fundamentally interested in preserving itself. And so I think all of these things will happen, and it is a constant pushing, right? So what I'm doing is pushing, and I realize I've overstated some of my claims wildly, but for the purpose of just kind of pushing the pile a little bit, right? And recognizing that it's going to come back the other way. So I think we have to think about this as kind of like institutions are part of the building blocks of society, all these professional associations and professional organizations that we are part of. But as I say to my students, institutions are comprised of individuals, right? And we have choices about what we're going to do. And so, so it's helpful so there's always going to be the tensions that you describe, I think. And there's just sort of, sometimes there are enabling factors that allow those norms to be legitimated, and sometimes they're not. The world isn't ready, or you get unlucky.
Yeah, or you get lucky. I mean, and then you're justified for having, we look back, a lot of changes have happened. At the time, people thought, how could a university be engaged in interdisciplinary activity at all that seemed to violate? And now a university can't be a university without interdisciplinary work. Lisa?
I wanted to comment on the fact that we all know that the house is on fire. And there is a certain, what we call affect phobia, where people are afraid to show emotion. And it is imperative that we now show emotion. And it's also very clear that people are different. If you do a Rorschach, one person sees two witches on broomsticks, somebody else sees the Madonna. We are good at different things, we respond to different things, and we have to take that into consideration as we look to see who can speak about issues naturally, a person who is naturally gifted with a certain amount of confidence, or someone who might be by nature less resilient, less confident, and so that person should be acknowledged as maybe having a different kind of contribution to make than one that will make him or her the target of something. I think Naomi can take it, maybe somebody else couldn't. And the last thing that I wanted to say is that if we're all speaking up that the house is on fire, individuals will not be noticed as they won't be as significant to those people who are looking for trouble. So if we're all talking about this all the time, then it's going to be a lot easier to be protected.
So that fits with another theme that ran through here, that established institutions, including professional associations, are very difficult to move and change. We should continue to try to do that, presumably. But what I was struck by, your activism and Jacob's and number of the rest of you, created new organizations or activities outside the mainstream organizations, which you were maybe forced to do that because you weren't getting responses. And the best example, in a way, was yours for the National Medical Association's effort. And so that, that suggests that there's something wrong or something too conservative about existing institutions, but it also is a hopeful point. I mean, to the extent that you and others have had success with that strategy, that's a partial solution or the beginning of a solution to preserving whatever is good about some institutions, but starting new ones and trying to change the old ones by having the new ones create new models. Yes, you, journalist.
Very briefly, I would just like to point out that the very best modern professional journalists have resolved these tensions you speak of. And that's how we do journalism. We are always advocates in the following sense at the very least. We're saying to you, and we're risking our reputations every time we try to write something or broadcast it, we're saying to you, I am an advocate for the following proposition, that what I'm about to tell you will be something that you're glad you learned once you learned it. That's what I'm advocating for. And we are people who understand professionally that all communication is biased, in the sense that all words, we just know that that's true from the philosophy of science. And so we're always risking that we're going to have convinced you by the time you take the time to read whatever we write or listen to whatever we have to say, that you will agree that it was important. That's a way that we're constantly, and the way we do that is by always examining what we think our observation biases are. That's the way you do journalism. You say, I think this is important because of the following bias that my bias is that I think that life is better than death, for example, and that you're going to agree when we do that in a fine way. So, in that sense, we're always risking advocacy in that sense at the very least, recognizing that all observation is biased, and that what you can do is try to come up with a better way of believing it, so to speak.
Well, so the way of overcoming bias is convincing people later that what...
No.
What
I'm trying to say is, we're always advocating for the idea that whatever we're about to tell you is something you'll agree is important once you learn it. It's something you don't know. That's what news is. And so we're advocating for the importance, at the very least, of what we're saying. And we base our credibility, we support our credibility by trying to convey to the audience what we think our biases are for suggesting that this will be important to you. And you can consider that.
And the
yourself.
protection is that, and the test of whether you succeeded is whether they come to say, yeah, oh, that's important, you convinced me, all right?
Yeah.
And what if they say, no, that's fake news?
Well, fake news, sorry, that's kind of just, I'm not just in the term.
Okay.
Fake
There's
news,
a,
does it like, they wouldn't say that.
we have time for, what? Who? Oh, Jacob, sorry.
I just want to respond to that. So you talk about the three risks, and I think several people have talked about the risks on both sides of bias, but also of status quo bias, of simplification going both ways, of exaggerated consensus, but also exaggerated doubt. But I do acknowledge the genuine risks, and I think that as we're weighing those risks, first of all, we have to think about the real risk of conservative norm overflow. So what might be right for an expert witness or for a judge may be not necessary for a law professor or for someone in some other position. But also our weighing of those two risks has to depend on an analysis of, first of all, which way the professions and institutions are leaning at the moment, but also our analysis of how the system is functioning as a whole generally. And I think climate change is just one of many prominent examples that lead me to conclude that the system as it is working now isn't functioning well, and we need to take some kind of risks to move away from what we're doing.
Yeah, Harold.
I hope this is somewhat helpful. You know, for years I was testifying on issues which are not so existential. Just a question of whether the economy is growing or not growing, what we can do to make it grow, things which are hardly existential in their nature. But I think in our conversations, I have some experience from that, and it relates to the conversation we've had. And there's another side to this conversation. That is the people we're trying to impact, not simply the ultimate beneficiaries, but the political system, the political actors here. And I think that's really important. They have, as a number of people have mentioned, different agenda, different time frame, and that has to somehow be fitted in with these various tensions which you mentioned. You know, I'm thinking right now of I don't know how many of you know, Alan Blinder is my colleague here in the economics department, has what he calls the lamppost theory. What's the lamppost theory? He says, well, political actors use experts, us, you know, the way a drunk uses a lamppost. Namely, lean on, not to be informed by. Or it doesn't look on it for light, it looks for support. And that's very often the case, that they're using expertise for important objectives they have, and that's their business. But my point is we should try to understand that better and try to see how what we can do can relate to that, because otherwise what we say is not going to be helpful.
Good. So actually, sociology of knowledge of the professional, how he can be or she can be abused, exploited, misused. So the professional as victim in a way. But that's, I think, a serious point. We are at stopping point, and I would say you've been terrific. This was a wonderful day. I've learned a lot. And I think this conference has shown that it's possible, it better be because it's critical, that professionals should speak up, act against, and yes, stand witness to this impending, or disaster. I said impending in my notes here, but it's actually with us now. And stand witness against the blindness of our leaders in all the institutions. And I've tried to bring out that the blindness is not just willful ignorance and stupidity, or not only self-interest or institutional protection, but it has something harder to get at, a kind of moral set of moral values, which you acknowledge, those of you who are very activists, you acknowledge, but you say, it's a matter of balance. Let's look at where we are. And where we are is in a crisis that calls for exceptional professional action and a new conception of professional responsibility. So the professional ethics role may create some real obstacles. We've heard about them. But they can and should be overcome. That is one big idea to take away. And thanks to everybody's thanks, Melissa and Nancy. I do the same thing. Nancy has many brilliant ideas. This was one of them. Asking me to summarize was not one of them. But thank you all for indulging this